समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where we take your questions, our viewers, on geopolitical developments across the world. I am Devdatta, and today our contributing editor and international relations expert Swasti Rao is joining us from Paris. How are you, Swasti?
Oh, very well, Devdatta. Thanks. Good to see you.
So, Swasti, as always, a very busy week on the geopolitical front. Of course, the Trump tariffs dominated the world, but apart from that, Rafale. The Indian government on Wednesday last week approved a 63,000 crore deal for procuring 20 Rafale M jets from France, which is why I thought it would be a good question to start today's episode. And two of our subscribers, Ravi Rules and Karthik Parashar, have this question for you: that how do you see this decision making by the government on the G2G deal with France for Rafale fighters for the MRFA program?
Right.
And why was this not done during the original MMRCA deal, which was for 126 aircrafts, but India went for just 36 eventually?
Okay.
Also,
Yeah, go ahead.
there's
Yeah.
one more question, so I'll let you answer both of them simultaneously. That with all the flip-flop decisions of Trump recently, do you think it made it easy for India to go with latest Rafale deal?
Okay, right. So there's a kind of a cluster of questions around Rafales, right? So let's start with that. Now, very quickly, just before I begin answering, this is an answer. This is a precise answer that I had taken. I mean, this is a precise question that I had taken up for the third episode of the Geopolitics with Swasti. So, in fact, I just kind of went back and checked what episode it was. So you can always log into that particular episode and see that I have taken these things into, like into details about why we sort of settled for only 36 Rafales initially, etc., and why the Air Force wanted more. But just to sort of give you a bit of a understanding on what happened. See, there are a couple of things that you need to sort of differentiate between. One is that the deal which is right now approved by the Indian government are the Rafale Marines. The Rafale Marines are for the Indian Navy. They are for the Indian aircraft carriers, right? They are called the Rafale Ms. What you are referring to here is the MRFA program, okay, which is for the Indian Air Force. Now, very quickly, first, I think this differentiation is required. And now let's get into the details of the MRFA program and the original MMRCA program. You see, around the year 2000, 2001, the Indian Air Force told the Indian establishment, the MOD, that they require at least 126 MMRCA. MMRCA basically means the medium multi-role combat aircraft. Okay. And if you remember, that was also the time when we were developing our own and all of that was happening. But we needed 126. So 126 was the number that the Indian Air Force told the MOD. Now, the MOD, in consultation with the Ministry of Finance, etc., said that, all right, we take into account that you have this requirement and then we will process it. Initially, what happened, that there was a tender. There about 5 aircrafts were shortlisted, and ultimately it was Rafales and the Eurofighter Typhoons which made it to the final rounds. And ultimately, we decided on the Rafales. Okay, now of course, Air Force was a part of this decision, etc., because this is the usual channel through which this happens. Now, once this was decided, the cost negotiating committee was formed, the CNC. The cost negotiating committee is the committee that looks after the combinations. The aircraft is not just the sticker price it's not just the on the road price of a car. Along with that comes accessories. And those accessories are, for example, what kind of sensors, what type of sensors, quality of sensors, similarly type of weapons, quality of weapons, what is the maintenance package, what is the crew training required, spares, etc., etc. All of that go into negotiating the final cost of the aircraft. Now, very quickly, when the cost negotiating committee was formed, Then it was decided that 24 of those Rafales are going to come from Dassault, which is the French company, and the rest of them, okay, so will be manufactured in India. However, this particular initial decision couldn't come through because Dassault Aviation said that we will not take any guarantee for the fighter jets that are made in India. We will only take guarantee for the ones that we make in France, which means only 24 out of this huge number. So the deal couldn't come through because, of course, we wanted them to take responsibility and guarantee for that as well. And they said that, no, we can't do that because you have a very different working environment, etc. I mean, a lot of details there were sort of not really working out in the favor. So that did not come through. And then it took another decade. Everything was delayed for another decade. Finally, in that another decade that followed, we also lost many squadrons. I mean, we had to retire squadrons, and then we lost some to the accidents, etc. And ultimately, then in through the G2G channel. Now, the G2G channel is a government to government channel, which is there to expedite the process, which is usually taken in the defense procurement channel. And now I just told you that going by the defense procurement channel, it was taking so many decades. So ultimately, to address the criticality, the government of the day decided that, okay, let us now use the G2G channel, and the G2G channel ke through, then they got the 36 Rafales. Okay. It doesn't mean that the Air Force wanted 36. The Air Force wanted 126, but only 36 came. They were expensive. Whatever decision the government took, that okay, right now we are getting you 36, and then we will see later. So that requirement of the remaining 90 or whatever, because we required 126 and we only got 36, so the other remaining lot, that requirement is still there. Okay. And in the years that have followed, since our domestic production and the of the Tejas MK and MK1s, etc., have been so much behind schedule, that now it seems as if import is going to be one option, and one serious option that we will have to consider. And now, coming to your question and connecting it to your question, when you say that there was a report and it was done by Snehesh, he said that the government is now seriously mulling over getting those remaining MRFAs from Rafales. I think now also you have to understand it a bit in context. So please understand that right now, because initially we made a requirement for 126, the Air Force had made a requirement of 126. We right now in India at Hashimara and Ambala, we have the infrastructure ready to absorb at least 100 more aircraft from Dassault Aviation. Okay. Now, this makes sense because if you only look at the sticker prices of the Rafales, they are pretty expensive. Okay. But because we already have the MRO facilities, we already have, the other infrastructure, the hangars, we have, trained crew, we have trained pilots. So if you look at the overall cost of a Rafale, it makes more sense that if we have to import, it makes sense for us to import Rafales. And this is something that I've also taken up again and again. And this is the context in which, you should be looking at what is currently happening. Despite that, please remember that no official confirmation has arrived from the government side. No official timelines have been set. But what I read from Snehesh's report, as well as what I read from the Air Force's mood, is that if at all we have to go for imports, it makes immense sense for us to go for Rafales because we have the capacity to absorb them. So in the longer run, this is going to be better economies to scale compared to, say, a scenario where we're going for a cheaper aircraft, but only the aircraft is cheap, right? We have to create that entire ecosystem around it. We have to train, and that is going to exponentially push the final price. So that is the context in which you have to understand. I think it is in the offing, but let's wait for an official confirmation as well. I hope it arrives soon.
And Swasti, do you think that this is also happening because of the decisions of Trump? Like our user Karthik Parashar asked you that, is it an impact of all the flip-flop decisions of Trump recently, which made it easy for India to go with the latest deal, or was it a well-thought-out decision since we already operate Rafale?
Oh, well, yes, it is a well thought out decision because we already operate the Rafales, and I gave you all the details. And please understand that these large ticket capital purchases, they take 3 to 4 years, okay, to be put together. So to argue that because Donald Trump came and we felt that we cannot rely on America, I don't think that's the way to look at it, especially when we are considering these large ticket capital purchases, especially for the defense equipment. This has not got to do with Trump, but Trump factor is going to play a role in the kind of decisions we take later on. I think it's a fair point to sort of note. But this one particularly, it's a well thought out decision. We already have it. We have been putting it together for the last many years, so it makes sense.
Right. So, Swasti, moving from that towards a more national security angle, Pakistani Canadian Tahawwur Rana was extradited to India on Thursday, and his extradition has been a long drawn legal battle. He's now in the NIA custody, and our subscribers have uh, a lot of questions on that. One among them, which I would take, is Aditya18893, who asks that Rana is finally back in India from the US. He's one of the convicts of the 26/11 attacks. Is there any lack of understanding and agreement with other countries which leads to such a lot of time for extradition of such criminals? And do you think that going forward, India can base inter country agreements and through its foreign policy, try to speed up such processes so that justice can be delivered on time?
Now, before I start answering your question, there is, I think, recently or some 2, 3 days ago, a national interest which was put together by Shekhar on the Tahawwur Rana, so which is very educative. So I urge all of you to watch that if you want to understand the nitty gritty and the details of it. But to your question specifically, now very quickly, if there can be an inter-country kind of an agreement, see, please understand that any inter-country agreement will not be able to supersede the legal system of that particular country that we are referring to. Okay, so the host country's legal processes are going to play out regardless of what we want. We can put in requests. We can say, of course, there is some agreement that there will be an exchange of such criminals and individuals that are charged with such serious crimes, but that country's individual legal processes will play out whether we like it or we don't. Now, very quickly, for example, just to give you one example as a parallel, you know that we've been wanting Nirav Modi and Mehul Choksi, and recently there was also Mehul Choksi, Vijay Mallya, and Lalit Modi, etc. Those are financial crimes, of course, which is very different from what the Tahawwur Rana has on his head. But what I'm trying to say is that we have been also waiting for them, but the host countries will exhaust their legal processes before they sort of turn them in. When it comes to the Tahawwur Rana, it's, in my opinion, a kind of a consolation prize for us because the real mastermind there was David Headley, and David Headley is still not coming. I don't think David Headley is going to come. He's already cut a sweet deal out there. He's going to serve a long sentence. So it's a bit of a consolation prize, but something is better than nothing. And Tahawwur Rana is going to be here. And let's see what happens to him. Let me not jump the gun. I don't think it'll be easy for him to get out from India. But what that said, that was not your question. Your question was whether India can do something to accelerate it. Through diplomatic channels, you can always put these extradition requests. We have about a list of 26 individuals to be extradited from Canada, if you remember, and we've been taking it up again and again with the Justin Trudeau government, and they kept sitting on that. Okay, so it was only in the recent controversy that it actually came to fore. So we can, if you have good enough diplomatic ties, we can put requests to accelerate. But frankly, you can do little about the legal systems and the processes of that particular country. So you have to take it into your stride. So that's the short answer to your question.
Right. And since we are already discussing US, Swasti, I mean, it's only fair that we go on to the Trump question because like we discussed, it's dominating everything around the world. So, based on that, our subscriber Ashutosh Tripathi has a question where he says, hello, Dr. Rao. Peter Zehan, the geopolitical analyst, has predicted that the decade will be the beginning of the era of de-globalisation. Would you agree with him? And then he asks, following up on that, are the Trump tariffs the beginning of the end then? And if so, does that increase or decrease the relative geopolitical heft of India?
Now, very quickly, Peter Zeihan, I'm not sure what exactly are you referring to because I've not really read any of his papers or any of his works. If this is YouTube video that you're referring to, then we have, then all right. Let me just try to put it into context for you. Now, when you say the era of deglobalization, do you frankly want to argue that you want to go back to the age of wood cutting and do you want to go back to the age of barters? I don't think that's the case. You have to put it into context, right? Just as we are realizing with COVID pandemic that we are entering into a newer era of how supply chains function. We are not looking at efficiency of supply chains, which is a hallmark of globalization. And we are looking more at friend shoring and we are looking more at resilience of supply chains, which may not be as efficient, but they are more trustworthy in times of crisis, etc. So I do see where this is coming from with countries under, now that Donald Trump has come, countries are becoming more protectionist, especially United States, that has been the precursor, that has been the torchbearer of free market and democracy and everything, is turning inward. So the question is very genuine. In that sense, I understand where this is coming from. But in a different sense, can you really argue that the interconnectedness of the world is decreasing or increasing? Globalization doesn't only mean that efficiency of supply chains were functioning in the way that there were low tariffs for developing countries, and the developed countries were buying products made in different parts of the world and adding their own value, etc., etc. It's not just that. That's a very, very simplistic model of globalization. Now look at what the pace of technology has done. Can you really frankly argue that technology has no role to play in the way our interconnectedness actually plays out? Or would you argue that a communication per se, or for example, AI per se, those kind of tools are not making it even more imperative that the world today is much more connected than it ever was at any given point in time in history? So I think what you have to sort of understand is that when it comes to trade, it is true that there is a lot of kerfuffle. There is a lot of disturbance because the torchbearer of free trade has kind of turned its back. But please also remember that Donald Trump is speaking to his domestic electorate, the domestic MAGA fan base that vote for him. And for him, for them, I'm speaking about from Donald Trump's vantage point, this has been something based on which he has been fighting and winning elections, right? He says for him, the entire world, the entire problem of America, right, is because America has been a very generous economy and America has to increase tariffs. He thinks that by increasing tariffs, he can fix everything else, which is not the case. And I don't have the bandwidth right now in these questions to actually get into the details of just how irrational his behavior has been. And frankly, is there any consistency there? Because we saw that first he slapped up tariffs on everybody. That formula by which he had come to those numbers was also very questionable. And then suddenly he said that except for China, I am now withdrawing it and stopping it for a few days for the other countries. Then Howard Lutnick comes and says that now they are mulling pharmaceutical tariffs over pharmaceuticals, which will have implications for India, etc., etc. There is a lot of kerfuffle. There is a lot of I would say there is no clarity right now. But trade. Protectionism, the return of trade protectionism is going to lead to a different engagement of countries when they do trade. Maybe this means the emergence of different trade blocs, right? Maybe it means that other countries are going to come together and understand that America is no longer going to do that. This is a breakdown in the liberal hegemony as far as trade was concerned. So therefore, something else might come up. But to argue that this is a kind of a deglobalization perhaps is taking it too far, because what exactly do you mean? And I gave you certain examples where you think the pace of travel, the pace of information, data sharing, all of that has reached unprecedented heights. So how do you then explain that with the sole lens of trade protectionism? So let's wait for the kerfuffle to settle and let's see what Donald Trump really frankly does in a few years, how that plays out.
So, Swasti, based on that, I think there are a few questions on the trade war that has started between US and China following Trump tariffs, and there are a lot of questions from our subscribers on what is happening between US, China, and then China and Taiwan. Following upon our Trump tariff questions. Anubhav Saxena from Bangalore, I'll take his question where he asks, the trade war that has started between China and the US, can it also lead to a military conflict like in Taiwan? And on similar lines, Tanusu asks, um, first of all, she talks about your previous episode on Worldview with Swasti, where you had talked about the potential conflict in Indo-Pacific, which she says was very informative. And she then has two follow-up questions on that. While both you and the guests agreed that the threat from China is real, she asks, what is China waiting for? And if and when China does attack Taiwan, does it have enough financial and military strength to continue to pose a direct and indirect threat to India?
Very yeah. And I just, because the this part of the question sort of ended with, does it have any threat for India? So let me just connect it with the previous part, because I think I kind of didn't answer that, which is that, does it also open up, the Trump tariff and etc. Does it open any space for India? Now, very quickly, this is India's sweet spot, okay, right now, and I will connect it to the conflict in Taiwan. So right now, the kind of era that we are living in is certainly India's sweet spot, and I've called it India's intersectional global moment. The point is that whether is India able to capitalize on it or not? Because, and when I say can India capitalize on it, I basically mean that can India really make sure that the investments that are not going to China are coming to India? Can India improve its investment infrastructure in the sense that ease of doing business? All of that remains a big problem for us, So whether or not we do it is something, the internal reforms that we require. I mean, I've been writing no end on this. So this is something that we have to, look at. It also, every crisis is an opportunity, and for sure, with what Donald Trump is doing, trade and global trade particularly is going to get a little more multipolar, in the sense that other trading blocs will emerge. So what is going to be India's role there? What is going to be India's degree of inclusion into the various supply chains and production chains is a very different topic, and we have very different challenges to tackle there. But it does open a sense, a window of opportunity for India. Now, very quickly on China, you see, is China ready? We all over the world, we have speculations about whether China is ready, and some people give it a timeline of 2027. Some people give it a different timeline. But all said and done, is China ready? Is something that China has to answer. Will it answer? I don't think China will answer. It will only keep dropping hints. And from what we know so far is that China wants to solve the Taiwanese question more by way of, first they started with appeasement, then they have now started doing more coercion. But whether they want to do like an unbridled, unabashed use of force, like a conventional war, like Russia rolling tanks into Ukraine, is something that I am still not very convinced with. Now, I know that you're referring to this particular Worldview episode, and Robert Eldridge, who is very much somebody that has spent many years in Taiwan, many years in Japan, and he's from the US Marine. Okay, so he is somebody whose opinion should be taken seriously. And if he said that, see, it's not a question of if, it is a question of when. But I think what we need a finer understanding of is that what really is China going to do? They have tried appeasement. There was a time when they were given so many loans and scholarships and everything to Taiwanese students, trying to project this narrative, to push this narrative that Taiwan is China. It didn't work. Even in Taiwan, by the way, not all parties that's the same. Right, there are certain parties that do not want to, that want a peaceful resolution, to this problem, etc. Lately, what you've seen is that now China is doing much more coercion under Xi Jinping in the last few years. They have been doing so many exercises. They have been penetrating the Taiwanese air defenses. There's been, like so much. And I gave a number also, I think 1,700 or sometimes they really pronged. So all of that is going on. But like I said, that I'm not convinced that they want to use conventional force until and unless the red lines are crossed. Now, you can always ask what those red lines are. Perhaps the one red line could be that if the Taiwanese parliament passes a resolution and say declares independence all of a sudden, like we declare independence, complete independence, that would be a red line. For sure, that would be a red line. And there's a reason why the Taiwanese don't do it, and they, everything is very subtle around it. Okay. So I think that would be a red line. Or if the United States of America starts to operate a base, like a proper military base, from the mainland of, Taiwanese island, that would be a red line too. So there is a reason why there is so much ambiguity, okay, from the Americans, from everybody. Nobody really knows what, frankly, is going to happen. And I would be it would be unfair on me, okay, to just give you a scenario. All we do as analysts and as researchers and experts is that we build scenarios over it. And I can certainly tell you that the Germans are building scenarios, the Americans are building scenarios, and when these scenarios are built, a typical scenario building exercise in Taiwan, and this is not military war games, this is about the larger question, the geopolitical equation and the geoeconomic equation, and how far the scenarios from the best case to the worst case is going to have an impact on countries of the region. And when these scenarios are built in India, some couple of weeks, 1 week ago, I was a part of the scenario building by a German foundation, and they put together, a whole host of Indian scholars and bureaucrats and, armed forces, I mean, of course, veterans and retired officers and strategic community members put together to understand how the scenario will unfold. And what we could see is that one of the first casualties there, right, would be the supply chains. There would be a disruption of supply chains. One doesn't know how the military part of it plays out, but at least the disruption of supply chains is going to have major implications for India, because we do not know how exactly countries of the region are going to respond. So that's another layer to the Taiwanese question, which is that what exactly is China going to be fighting against? If it is only Taiwan, then perhaps it's not a big deal. But if it is something for Taiwan, if they do something and then the collective West puts sanctions on China, China is much more sensitive to sanctions, by the way, compared to Russia. Russia was never that embedded in the global supply chains. Russia was only selling weapons and hydrocarbons to the world. Okay. So please understand that China is much more embedded into the global manufacturing chains, supply chains, API, rare earth. I mean, you cannot compare the case of China with the case of Russia. And one of the things that the Chinese did very early on in the war in Ukraine was that they created study groups to study the impact of secondary sanctions and sanctions on Russia. So they wanted to see what are the loopholes of the sanctions regime. They wanted to see how far is the collective West willing, the sanction regime is willing to push the sanction agenda. So they have a fairer understanding. So like I said, that I think if it is below the threshold of the red line, which I think it is going to remain, okay, it is going to remain below the threshold of that, the crossing of the red line, okay. Until then, you will see a mix of everything. You will see a mix of, all of these coercive exercises, these belligerent exercises, penetrating the air defense zone, doing something, sending a warship, okay, cutting off, Taiwan in a temporary manner, etc. You will see a lot of these things. And then you will also see a lot of gray zone. Why did you think China unveiled their gray zone capabilities, their abilities to cut the undersea cables if they didn't really intend to do it? So they are really threatening and they are really testing waters all the time. But the question of Taiwan really is very, very complex. And I think Taiwanese also understand that there is no way they can win or fight a full-fledged war like Ukrainians have done. So everybody will try to keep it just below the threshold so that it doesn't translate into like a proper war. That's there. And this is something that actually keeps a lot of people awake at nights as to what really happens. And from India's perspective, please remember we have certain reciprocal arrangements with the United States of America. So will India allow for, the United States naval capabilities then, right, in a direct access? Will they allow? We have some reciprocal arrangements. Will that mean India is a part of the war? Will India sit on the fence as usual? There is really no answer to that. Okay, so we can go on speculating, but coming back to the main thing, I think it is in everybody's interest, including China's, to just keep it below the threshold of a full-fledged war and just to keep it destabilized enough so that they are able to gain what they want to gain out of that. But it will not die. Please remember, it will not die. That is what Xi Jinping's political career somewhere also depends on. Not everybody in the political bureau, the Politburo of the CCP is happy with him. So he also has to keep it alive. So it's a very tense situation there.
So, right, Swasti, I think we have covered this week's important questions, and you have done it from Paris. So, thank you so much for taking out time. This was an extremely enriching and insightful conversation. And to our viewers, please stay tuned for our next episode and do send in your questions. Thank you,
Thank you,
Swasti.
Lata. Have a good day. Bye.